Oliver Cromwell overthrew the Stuart monarchy and ruled England for 5 years as Lord Protector. His state funeral in 1658, unlike the funerals of many who seized power at the end of revolutions, was an occasion of genuine and widespread mourning. Yet 2 years later, the monarchy was restored and Cromwell's corpse was exhumed and decapitated in a grisly echo of Charles I's execution. The severed head was then displayed outside the Palace of Westminster at the end of a pole where it remained for over 20 years. He was hardly seen as a Great Briton then, or for the next 200 years. Cavaliers, and later the Tories, saw him as a king killer. Old Republicans reviled him as the man who shipwrecked the revolution. 18th century Whigs shunned him. They portrayed themselves as protectors of liberty and property, and his zeal was an embarrassment to them. This towering figure in our history became a shadowy figure from a dangerous past. It was left to the 19th century to reclaim him, both as hero and villain. But in doing so, he was stained and varnished, mythologized as much as restored to prominence. The Cromwell we have grown up with is product of a Victorian double myth, which we can see in the rumpus in Parliament in 1895 over whether to place this statue of Oliver outside the Palace of Westminster. Both parties were split on the issue. Many Conservatives now admired him as a patriot and imperialist, but others remembered him as a dissenter and radical. Many Liberals proclaimed him a precursor of Victorian values of piety and laissez-faire, but others, notably their Irish allies, recalled his butchery of their ancestors. The outcome was a classic British fudge. The statue was erected, but payment was to come not from the public purse, but from the private wallet of Lord Rosebery, the Liberal Prime Minister. No Englishman has generated such a volume of writing over the past 150 years. There's even a Cromwell museum here in his old schoolroom in Huntingdon. Certainly, no one has divided writers and readers so completely. Precursor of liberal democracy and religious toleration, or proto-fascist, iconoclast, and butcher of Ireland. Liberator of England from royal and ecclesiastical tyranny, or military dictator and religious fanatic. Historians are now struggling to remove that Victorian varnish to reveal the far more fascinating man underneath, the man of his own times. His claims to greatness can be quickly established. A brilliant soldier, a decisive statesman, a bulwark of the social order in the midst of revolution, and, as we shall see, a religious visionary. An obscure 40-year-old country gentleman in 1640, he rose to be head of state within the next 14 years. He had no previous military training or experience, but he rose through charismatic leadership and example to command the cavalry of the main parliamentary army by the end of the Civil War. He became its second in command in 1648 and its commander-in-chief in 1650. He crushed royalist insurrectionaries and Scottish invaders and led a brutal conquest of Ireland and a less brutal but just as complete conquest of Scotland. Later, he organised continental and colonial expeditions that brought Britain greater recognition as a military power than it had enjoyed for 250 years. He was a radical voice, but hardly a party leader in the House of Commons in the 1640s. In fact, it was as a general rather than as a politician that he determined the course of the Puritan Revolution. He was a driving force in all the central revolutionary acts, the beheading of the king and the abolition of monarchy and House of Lords, the dismantling of the Church of England and the legal establishment of religious freedom. The paradoxes of Cromwell's career are the paradoxes of his age, the paradoxes of Puritanism, of gentry landowners like his father, but also of revolutionaries overthrowing the landmarks of the Constitution in order to conserve existing liberties. The English Civil War had begun as a struggle to make Charles I more accountable to the law and to his subjects, and to transform the Church of England into a more effective instrument of evangelical Protestantism. We now know that only a minority of Englishmen accepted the need for civil war in the 1640s. Most believed that the issues were negotiable, and that a war would only make matters worse. Some even organised to prevent the fighting spreading to their area. That minority who made things happen tended to be those who were driven by a radical Christian vision. Cromwell was associated with the most radical religious voices, crying down bishops in the Book of Common Prayer. He was one of those who saw the conflict in England and in the world as a stark choice between popery and Protestantism, freedom and slavery, as some in our own day see us gripped in a global struggle between democracy and communism. In 1642, as most men dithered and did what they were told, Cromwell was one of that small minority who answered, indeed issued, the call to arms. Cromwell didn't yet see the need to depose or to execute Charles I. It took the horrors of war and much more evidence of Charles's double-dealing to make him come to that view. But he was obsessed by the need to compel the king to take the advice of the godly and to devote himself to the destruction of popery at home and abroad. For him, the moment of decision came before the first clash of armies, as the silver plate of the Cambridge colleges was assembled in wagons, ready for a long journey to York, where the king could use it to buy guns and muskets and pikes. Yet the silver belonged to the colleges, and their gift to the king was a voluntary one. To seize it was theft. If peace broke out, Cromwell could be hanged. His decision to use force to prevent the shipment of that silver marks him out as one of the few men so confident in his judgment that he would shape events rather than be buffeted by them. Throughout his life, he showed the same nerveless decisiveness in moments of crisis. Perhaps the hardest thing for the historian to illustrate, and yet the most palpable aspect of Cromwell's dominance of his age, was that ability to command events. Often, it was a brutal assertiveness, but not always so. In November 1647, he was faced by a mutiny in 2 regiments at Corkbush Field near Ware in Hertfordshire. Cromwell rode up and down ranks of sullen troopers, pulling radical pamphlets from their hatbands. He acted on his instinct and was proved right. He guessed the soldiers were there merely to demonstrate, not to use force. His assertion of authority worked. But 18 months later, as he harangued troops in Hyde Park, calling upon them to follow him to the west, to discipline and, if necessary, to execute fellow soldiers who were refusing to cross to fight in Ireland, his approach was different. Faced by heckling, he played not the bully, but the man of reason, calling up one of the hecklers and freely debating the issues with him before demanding and receiving the full support of the men for his march against the mutineers. Cromwell was a dynamic leader, at his best on a battlefield or in a crisis. He was also a man who seemed, as he himself confessed, to know what he would not have far more than what he would have. If there appear to be profound inconsistencies between his religious, political, and social policies, then we must seek out a consistency deeper still. To find it, we must recognize that he was driven by moral and spiritual imperatives, not by intellectual ones. He was first and foremost a Puritan and a gentleman. As Lord Protector, he accepted the need for a certain amount of traditional ceremonial to mark his status. But as is well illustrated in this late portrait of him by Maskell, Cromwell lived humbly in the style of the godly country gentleman he had been for most of his life. Like all good 17th century Puritans, he combined excess in his relations with God and moderation in his relations with mammon, rather the reverse of modern Puritanism. It is his Puritanism that affords the key to his personality, to his successes and to his failures. He believed in the utter fallenness and sinfulness of man, which meant that left to their own devices, all men would wallow rather cheerfully in a cesspit of ignorance and superstition. He believed in the existence of a godly minority chosen by God to be his instruments in making men aware of their duties to love and serve him, and in the duty of a Christian magistracy to impose that order. And he believed in providences, that is, God intervening directly in the affairs of men, making his will known to men by rewarding the virtuous and punishing the wicked. When a drunk fell into a stream and was drowned, or when the floor collapsed, causing the death of many Catholics engaged in clandestine worship, God was at work in the affairs of men. Belief in such providences was essential to Puritanism. Here, in this Huntingdon schoolroom, in the year 1608 to 14, Dr. Thomas Beard instructed the young Oliver. But Beard was more than a provincial schoolmaster. He was also the author of The Theatre of God's Judgment, a best-selling catalogue of God's providences. Cromwell's providentialism dominated his political career. It's impossible to exaggerate the centrality of massive family Bibles like this one to the thinking of men like Oliver Cromwell. For him, as for most Puritans, the Old Testament provided clear evidence of God's direct intervention in the history of the people of Israel, his chosen people. 85% of all biblical references in Cromwell's speeches are drawn from the Old Testament, above all from the books describing the trials and tribulations of the Jews and from the Psalms. Cromwell believed that there were precise, vital parallels between those events and the events of his own time. He knew that God had delivered the Israelites from slavery in Egypt and in Babylon, but only when they returned to full religious obedience to him. He believed that God was now inviting his new chosen people, the English, to a metaphorical trek from servitude under Stuart kings to a new land of Canaan, guided by a new pillar of fire represented by the victories he had granted to the new model army. In a speech delivered in July 1653, Cromwell said, "I have not thought it amiss a little to mind you of that series of providences wherein the Lord hitherto hath dispensed wonderful things to these nations, from the beginning of our troubles to this very day. We expected and had some reasonable confidence that our expectations should not be frustrated, that the authority that then was, having such a history to look back unto, such a God that appeared to them so eminently, so visibly, that even our enemies many times confessed that God himself was engaged against them, or they should never have been brought so low, nor disappointed in every undertaking. I say, we did think and had some reasonable confidence that coming up then, the mercies that God had showed, the expectations that were in the hearts of all good men, would have prompted those that were in authority to have done those good things which might by honest men have been judged a return fit for such a God and worthy of such mercies." In fact, those in authority had gone on for continuous political malingering. The days they should have spent on drafting a new constitution or on creating religious liberty had been wasted on trivial side issues, defining obscure terms like encumbrances in minor bills, or in deciding whether to ban tobacco growing in Gloucestershire. Cromwell had no doubt that such failure to follow the hand of God justified his military coup. There's nothing unusual about all this. These are the hallmarks of Puritanism that had given the activists the assurance to take on Charles I. They were defending liberties and building a new Jerusalem, a more just society, more mindful of and obedient to the revealed will of God. But in other ways, Cromwell was untypical, and in one way, possibly unique. Mainstream Puritans assumed that the elect would be gathered together into a new church based on scriptural forms, and that that church would be the instrument of a new and full reformation, that is, reformation, a spiritual regeneration under the word of godly preachers and the rod of godly magistrates. But then their world fell apart. To win the war, Parliament had to suspend and violate civil rights. It had to increase taxation 20-fold, take more than half the horses in the kingdom from the plough for military use, pull down many bridges that halted the advance of enemy armies and halted the flow of goods to market. As their material world collapsed, so too did their Puritan unity. Many, perhaps most of the godly, despaired. Cromwell was spared that disillusion and lassitude. He was fortified by the peculiar confidence of having led Bible-carrying, psalm-singing soldiers into victory after victory. He became convinced that the sufferings of the nation, the hardness of heart of an unrepentant monarch, the very breakdown of so many constitutional and religious landmarks, were all signs of a much deeper divine purpose, an unparalleled breaking of the political mold. Just as God had led the people of Israel out of Egypt, across the Red Sea, into the desert, where they had dwelt squabbling and complaining, until Moses could persuade them to make further efforts to reach the promised land. So the people of England, liberated from Stuart and Anglican tyranny, must endure a period in the desert before they secured the full benefits of liberation. Cromwell accepted that the faint-hearted would complain. There would be, he said, much repining in the desert, for God's call was never easy. In one of his most startling metaphors, he told Parliament in 1654 that you are a people newly under circumcision, but raw. Circumcision, the symbol of incorporation into the people of God, was a painful business. All around him, but scattered amongst the various churches and sects, Cromwell saw men with what he termed the root of the matter in them, an inner strength and integrity that indicated that they shared the spark of faith. This is what underpinned Cromwell's belief in religious liberty. Men in all Protestant traditions and sects, from James Ussher, formerly Archbishop of Armagh, to George Fox, the Quaker, possessed some fragment of the truth. His task was to gather up these fragments to make up a mosaic of God's truth. He had no time for those who refused to use their liberty to contribute to that search. Above all, the Catholic Irish, whose 1641 rebellion had led to the slaughter of thousands of Protestants. They were to be persecuted and punished. Toleration, then, was for Cromwell only the means to allow a deeper, fragmented unity to emerge. His policy does not prefigure modern religious pluralism. It was the noblest aspect of his vision of a society learning obedience to God. Without understanding Cromwell's religious faith, we will never understand his political doubts. He was not, he said, wedded and glued to forms of government. He was certainly no political theorist, and his thought was both conventional and cloudy. He was willing to use his position as head of the army to underwrite a variety of experiments recommended to him by his colleagues, but he always withdrew his support once he came to believe that the kingdom of Christ was not being realized. For while he was not wedded and glued to forms of government, he was wedded and glued to the ends of government. And those ends were to make the people of England recognize and lay claim to God's promises to them. Just as Moses knew that he was being guided towards a promised land without ever knowing quite what it would look like, so Cromwell had no certainty about precisely what God had in store for his new people. He followed a pillar of fire and not a blueprint. He was as indifferent to Magna Carta and to ancient liberties as he was to the divine right of kings. The past must not impede the future. Nor did he seek a popular mandate or claim to govern by consent. Government was, he said, for the people's good, not what pleases them. In 1653, he and his fellow officers forbade free elections. Instead, they handpicked 140 men fearing God and of known integrity, and empowered them to govern. As Lord Protector, he placed political as well as social and economic restrictions on the right to vote and to sit in the Protectorate parliaments. He purged all the elected parliaments between 1647 and 1658 of those he deemed obstructive. A similar authoritarianism led him to yearn for the day when men would come to recognize their liberation and turn from the things of the flesh to the things of the spirit, from carnal reasonings to the way of the Lord. Meanwhile, he and other saints must govern for them. He was thus no proto-democrat. He was an authoritarian liberal. At the heart of his plan of government was what he called the reformation of manners. This was to be a rolling program of action against superstition, immorality, and worldliness. The regulation of alehouses, a strict enforcement of Sabbath observance, a firmer line against sexual incontinence, and a crackdown on vain and fleshly pursuits. This ordinance, prohibiting cockfights, is typical of the programme. Nothing he attempted was dearer to his heart, and nothing he attempted was more futile. In 1660, the return of the maypoles all over England was a pre-echo of the return of the king. The major generals were but one example of his willingness to violate the most fundamental civil liberties, where he believed that they stood in the way of the building of Jerusalem. He justified arbitrary taxation, arbitrary imprisonment, legislating without parliamentary approval by simple appeals to providence and occasionally to a baser pragmatism. If nothing were ever done but what is according to law, the throat of this nation may be cut while we send for some to make a law. For those who shared this vision, Cromwell differed from Charles I, crucially, in that he used his power to further and not to obstruct the work of the godly. For those who did not share his vision, Cromwell seemed an even worse tyrant. No wonder Cromwell was so willing to chop and change his constitutions. On 4 occasions he used military force to impose a political settlement, either by purging parliaments of what he termed incendiaries, or by dissolving them altogether, and by imposing fresh constitutional arrangements whose only origin and authority came from his army colleagues. The most dramatic such episode took place on the 20th of April 1653. Cromwell, this remarkable hat crammed on his head, harangued the Rump Parliament on its selfishness and failure to promote the gospel. He then called in soldiers to drive the members from the chamber. Yet Cromwell refused to assume supreme authority himself. Instead, he set up the nominated assembly of 140 men who were to attempt to find ways to educate the people into understanding the lessons of the revolution, to persuade them to turn from the things of the flesh to the things of the spirit, so that they could be entrusted with powers of self-government. Cromwell's refusal to take absolute power when it was in the palm of his hand in April 1653 gives the lie to the view that he was driven by an overweening personal ambition. He was no Napoleon Bonaparte. Even when he did become head of state as Lord Protector under this paper constitution, the instrument of government, he appears to have put himself more in the background than his friends intended. And there's no doubt that the repeated references in his speeches to the limited role he saw for himself were sincerely meant. In the same spirit, his rejection of the crown in 1657 seems best explained in religious terms rather than as a failure of nerve in the face of army pressure. It's true that he was drawn towards the old symbols of authority, as the imperial insignia on these coins illustrate, but he drew back from the crown itself. He could not bring himself to restore an institution which he believed God had ordered to be overthrown. As he put it, "I will not seek to set up that which Providence hath destroyed and laid in the dust. I would not build Jericho again." The greatest paradox, of course, is that while Cromwell's visionary drive freed him from constitutional and ecclesiastical conventions, it did not free him from social conventions. He was willing, indeed determined, to test a man's fitness to fight in the Civil War by his zeal and not by his pedigree. But he never envisaged overturning the social order. He was convinced that the established order was natural and just. Injustice was the consequence of individuals abusing their position and failing to discharge their responsibilities. If all men accepted their lot and accepted the duties to others which were part of that lot, then all would be well. Cromwell's political and religious programs were primarily intended to make the existing social order work. He did not want to change society. He wanted to change man in society. It is this, more than anything else, that makes him seem so naive to us. But the combination of religious zeal and social conservatism was precisely what made him the epitome of the revolution. It was the paradox which kept him in power. He alone could satisfy both the radical hunger for a new Jerusalem and the traditional elite's yearning for the protection of their power and influence. And yet, not quite. His violations of the rule of law made men of property uneasy, not sure of him. It was this that made them offer him the crown in 1657. It was intended to subject him to the constraining bonds of tradition and custom. Kingship, they told him, without any sense of irony given their experience over the previous 30 years, was known to the law. King Oliver could have presided over an Elizabethan-style mixed monarchy, decentralized, undertaxed, a gentle paternalism. But though one side of him was drawn to that comfortable retreat, "I'm hugely taken with that word settlement," he said. The dominant side could never abide it. A man less obsessed than Cromwell, with a godly vision, would never have risen from country squire to Lord Protector. The fire in his belly was not to be extinguished with the blandishments of power. With Cromwell's death, there was no one to hold the contradictions of the interregnum in creative tension. Within 2 years, Charles II had been restored. Cromwell's legacy is an intangible one. All the institutions he had destroyed as tyrannical surged back. But kings would never again seek to govern without Parliament, even if they would seek to suborn the independence of parliaments. And the Church of England was never again able to impose more than a rhetorical claim to the allegiance of the whole nation. But the very zeal which had impelled Cromwell was a quality shunned after 1660. He was the last great representative of Reformation enthusiasm, the attempt to improve man by perfecting human institutions. All over Europe after the 30 Years' War, and in England after the Restoration, attempts to build God's kingdom here on earth were abandoned. Man accepted that in a broken and fallen world, nothing could be achieved through the strivings of monarchs and parliaments. Instead, each individual should strive to build a temple of grace within himself or herself. Religion remained a vital force, and religious divisions dominated politics. But heroic attempts to build Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land were not to be heard of again for many decades, and in Cromwell's sense, never again. His fierce determination to compel men and women to accept the responsibilities of freedom contributed little to liberal democratic values. Yet, when I heard that during the Second World War, the statue of Charles I at Westminster was taken away and hidden as being too precious a work of art to be exposed to the risk of German bombs, but that the Thornycroft statue of Cromwell, sword in one hand, Bible in the other, remained under fire, I could not help feeling that it was obscurely appropriate.